being the first major leap into the third dimension, Sonic Adventure, a game that may compare to the likes of Super Mario 64 and The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time in making a successful transition from 2D to 3D. But the pathway to build Sonic Adventure was one that went through a lot of internal political strife and a lot of changing ideas at that. Whether it be the idea of making it for the Sega Saturn, completely redesigning Sonic, and remaking levels constantly. Today, on the first of this multi-part episode of Cut Content, we shall explore the history and beta unused content of Sonic Adventure. If you enjoy this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the like button too to further support us and keep creating new videos. For a while now, and now in 1994, Sonic was being developed by the Western Sega branch called Sega Technical Institute, or STI to be short, their last game being Sonic & Knuckles. With the completion of that game, series co-creator Yuji Naka, along with much of the Japanese staff that was working at STI, decided to return back to Japan. This would as such leave Sonic in the hands of non-Japanese staff for the time being. However, Yuji Naka's return was one with a plan, to meet up with fellow co-creator Naoto Oshima to create a new development team at Sega Japan called Sonic Team, reviving the old team name that made the very original Sonic the Hedgehog game for the Genesis. Their plan, however, was not to make Sonic games, and make original games instead, which led to masterpieces such as Nights into Dreams, being developed for the Saturn. Meanwhile, the Sega Saturn being on the market meant that a new 3D Sonic game was needed, this being handled by the remnants of STI, which now sorely lacked the classic Sonic team. While they had many visions of what Sonic could be in 3D, they ultimately came to design Sonic Extreme. Yuji Naka, who saw this project, stayed out of it, outside of simply saying, "Good luck." This project, however, hit many hurdles through numerous changes in direction until the project was outright cancelled. Something that left a major gaping hole in the Saturn's lineup. Something that the board at Sega felt, even with the numerous other Sonic games to fill the void. It was clear that the only way to save Sonic at this point was with its original team, the Sonic Team. As such, the Sonic team, despite wanting to keep working on other titles including their next game Burning Rangers, were roped into making the big jump for Sonic in 3D. So in planning the jump to 3D, senior game designer of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, Takashi Iizuka, proposed the idea of a Sonic RPG as the next jump for the series, a strange departure from what was a simple 2D platforming series. But this was more an RPG for telling a deep story rather than playing like a Phantasy Star game, with the ability of the Saturn hardware offering the ability to tell stories in large 3D spaces. An emphasis on the plot seemed like a good direction, just as Sonic 3 and Knuckles were a good jump. Now serving as the director of the Sonic RPG, Takashi Iizuka approached much of the people who worked on previous Sonic games at the company on what Sonic was to them, and this was to figure out what is the best way to transition Sonic from 2D to 3D. After all, if done improperly, it could falter like other series had at that point, such as Castlevania 64, and to that, much argument was made between the team on how Sonic should function in 3D, and eventually, a consensus was reached. Utilizing building blocks, a simple test level was made. Repeatedly, tests showed the level lasting roughly only 10 seconds with how fast Sonic was, and thus constant trial and error until a test level of proper length was made for the blue hedgehog to run on. Being that these were early stages of the game, character designs were now underway too, with artist Satoshi Okano tasked to make these. Which of course we had our usual Sonic, Tails, and Eggman in what looked classic, but stylized. But also a few new characters, including Spider-Girl and Fly the Bat. On top of that, several locations were designed too, including Mystic Ruins, these extra stages, and even some internals of Eggman's lair, and what might even be some boss vehicles for him too. Now being that it was the Saturn era, the team started to build it as the main Sonic game of that console, and to fill the void that Extreme just couldn't. and so several locations were being developed, much of which being more forest-like locations and designs from the concept art such as Mystic Ruins here, with one even having a tower that Sonic was to clearly scale, but as well a water level, and what might be the earliest version of the Sky Chase level from the final game, with Tails flying the tornado here. But this was rather deep into 1996, with the Saturn's lifespan planned to come to a close as of 1998, which was set to be the launch of Sega's next machine, codenamed Katana. Realizing that it was futile to keep going with a dying machine, and with how big Sonic levels were going to be anyways, they decided to push it to the next generation as a launch title. This led to Yuji Naka as a result even being involved in the hardware development of the now titled Dreamcast in order to be able to handle what they wished to do. But despite all this work done, the team didn't want it to go to waste, so they decided to place the earliest build they had within the Sonic World segment of the Saturn Sonic Collection, Sonic Jam. And so this became what could be said to be a preview of what was to come, especially with much of Sonic's physics appearing to be similar to his final iteration. In the bold approach to reinvent Sonic for a more realistic story-driven Sonic RPG, this even came down to them even wanting to redesign Sonic himself. This at first wasn't planned for the Sonic RPG, but actually for that game collection Sonic Jam. Artist Satoshi Okano was tasked by series character designer Kazuyuki Hoshino to make promotional art for the game to be featured in the Sega Saturn magazine. Utilizing Hoshino's love for urban culture, this new stylized art of Sonic came about. Clearly, a lot of thought and feelings went into this one design of Sonic, and while it was art for Sonic Jam, Yuji Naka really liked this art and saw potential in it in bringing Sonic into the 21st century, and thus ran an internal design competition between Sega artists on what design they could make based on this to bring as the central design for the now titled Sonic Adventure. You had Yuji Uekawa's, which gave longer limbs to Sonic, a new rendition by the original artist Satoshi Okano, a really radically different one by Takumi Mitake with his odd light blue design and red eyes, and this one by Sega co-creator Naoto Oshima, which had Sonic with sharp teeth. In the end, Yuji Uekawa's design won. This design gave a new flair to Sonic by making him look more adult now, having green pupils, as well as better color balance with the blue better matching Sega's logo. Being that this was the victor, Uekawa was now the character designer of Sonic Adventure, and was tasked to redesign all the characters in this new art style, which while Tails and Knuckles designs were done in a similar manner, Eggman and Amy Rose got a complete redesign that would better fit the new realistic art style that they were going with. Though Eggman was initially designed to keep his old design before the transition. And so Sega's next generation console was on the way. The team was ready to take full advantage of its power. For this, they had plans to showcase various locations in detailed 3D, including a Central and South American inspired location. As such, the team took a trip to visit Aztec sites and forests through Mexico and Peru. Of course, it's not like previous Sonic games didn't have such locations, and were all designed from them seeing them in popular media. This trip, however, was to add fresh inspiration to the team, all leading to the team to capture every moment on camera, and led to developing levels including Mystic Ruins, Emerald Coast, Lost World, and the Sandhill level of Tails. In fact, the sandboarding was added to Sandhill simply because they saw people in Peru doing it. Some textures in fact found in these levels were pulled straight from the photos they took. And so the levels were being designed in their earliest state, such as Windy Valley, as seen here in its earliest iteration and looking very rough. Now, a new idea the team had was to make each character have their own story, path, and playstyle, which in addition to that, they wished to include new characters to raise the appeal of the game. The first one of these being the robot E-102 Gamma, who was added in due to request for a shooting component to be added to the series, and well, the team sure didn't want to give any existing character a gun. Yet. He went through a few iterations with a spiffy one that even featured a hat, but the long limbs, gun, and roundish body were always at play. This along with Big Zakat, who was designed more as a character who would be relaxed next to the rest of the cast to the point that he was designed as Fishing Minigame the character, and the design definitely evolved quite a bit. always depicted as bigger than Sonic, and at one point much bigger than Sonic, but overall kept a relaxed design, except for this one that looked like an angrier cat. Though this one actually looked more like a raccoon than a cat, actually. But of course there was also the factor of Super Sonic. The plan was to have him appear anywhere like in the classic games, but since it required designed levels for both Sonic and Super Sonic, he was removed and only kept for the final boss. Now up to this point, the main villain of every game had been Dr. Robotnik, and Iizuka wished to change that up this time with a new villain who would be separate from Dr. Robotnik. The idea being a character that was liquid and transparent, as a means to show the power of the Dreamcast, and thus formed Chaos, the game's main antagonist. Character that would repeatedly evolve and change shape, an idea that Yuji Naka instantly approved upon seeing the concept on it. And following that was Sonic Team taking inspiration from the previous game, Nights into the Dream, whereby these fairy-like creatures existed called Nightopians, were being brought back to create a more in-depth species called Chow. This is part of a new side game experience whereby you could raise them, another purpose being taken for those new to Sonic. With development deep into the mix, this was still a hidden project, but word was starting to get out that Sonic Team was making a new Sonic game after so long. This along with those early concept shots of the Saturn version of the game leaking out. Some as such even thought the game would be called Sonic & Knuckles RPG based on these. Somehow. But otherwise, the main game itself was a closely guarded secret, while large speculation for the game was on the rise. Eventually, Sega announced that on August 22nd, 1998, they would be doing a public unveiling of the game at last at the Tokyo International Forum, now officially titled as Sonic Adventure. This wasn't just some throwaway announcement either, this was a truly big deal to the point of ads being plastered on subway trains, television, and even radio stations. In fact, the hype grew so large, Sega turned this into 3 events now, and was to be streamed online and recorded on VHS for those who missed the event. Hilariously, in May 1998, a screenshot of Sonic and Speed Highway leaked of the game showcasing a version of the level that was a good deal darker in fact. Many, however, took it as fake right off the bat. This along with 4 screenshots that leaked around June or July of 1998 off a French website. Regardless, none of these took away from the hype that was to come. And so, the day of the event reached, and lines were long, with many lined up for hours. The show was presented by Yuji Naka himself, along with famous Japanese radio hosts, and this was where the world at long last saw live gameplay footage of Sonic Adventure for the Sega Dreamcast. It was a good 40 minutes of footage that was shown, and a ton of early details of the game were seen. Some just simple small differences compared to the final iteration, like Emerald Coast having 4 instead of 5 springs, but there are also some heavier differences too, like Knuckles having an uppercut attack that was removed. Now quickly enough, some of the early Saturn assets had made their way into this version of the game, including not just the jumping animations of Sonic and Tails looking similar to their Sonic Jam versions, but within the Sky Chase level, when the Tornado 2 transformation scene happens, we see Sonic and Tails in their Sonic Jam models instead here. All clearly left over from the Saturn version of Sky Chase that we saw earlier. Otherwise, within Sky Chase, what we have is an absolute dragon, something that is scrapped by the final game. A shame. Continuing with other levels, Emerald Coast is missing nearly all of its decorations at the beginning, Windy Valley being quite different, being much more open-ended and colorful, with all objects having animations, something that had to be removed for performance. Stranger is Amy and Biggs are seen here, despite not being there in the final game. Twinkle Park's Act 1 being completely different, along with a usable Tails here. Now with Speed Highway at the forefront of this demo, a lot was seen, which as seen in that leaked screenshot, it was much darker initially and lacked a blue tint. In this version, Tails was using Sonic's section for this level however. Along with Speed Highway, Red Mountain also had a decent showing, which here it had Knuckles and Gamma in Sonic's levels instead. I'm starting to see a trend here. Otherwise, the level is an example of a lot of little things differing, such as several different details looking more complex here, like the skulls with a glowing effect and lighting being better. Within Lost World, we see an extra Boa Boa, but as with before, we see Knuckles in a level that he shouldn't be in. Mystic Ruins having a jungle with 2 paths that didn't make it into the final game, Ice Cap having tons of dead trees at the beginning that are removed by the end, and Final Egg, which has different enemy and laser placements. And what's interesting on top of all of that is that an early version of the final boss's theme, Open Your Heart, is not sung by Crush 40 and instead sung by Japanese metal singer Aizo Sakamoto, which as such has a more English take on it. And thanks to this event, it quickly became one of the most wanted games out there and emboldened the Sonic team to meet the deadline of December 1998. Meanwhile, just as with this event, advertisements for the game were rampant, with murals of Sonic across Shibuya, along with Sega staff including Yuji Naka himself even dressing up as Sonic characters to support dealers across Shinjuku, Akihabara, and Ikebukuro. And over time, more trailers and playable demos of the game were presented, showing more and more of the complete game, until the game released on December 23, 1998, receiving high praise right out of the gate, with Famitsu magazine even giving it a very close to perfect score of 38 out of 40, with many considering it as a perfect jump from 2D to 3D, akin to how Mario had done previously, and launching only weeks after the Dreamcast. What Sega had failed with the Saturn felt right again. Sonic was back front and center, and the console and the company mascot once more, and in a whole new light. Despite the game being complete, Sonic Team felt the game could still use further polish before getting a proper Western release. For that, several Sonic Team members flied out to the US Sega headquarters in San Francisco to establish Sonic Team USA to focus on localizing the game and set up a 2-pronged plan to 1. Further develop and polish the existing game, and 2. Would have them localizing the game themselves for a change, which Sonic Team USA decided to unify the story of Sonic worldwide this time. Normally, there were differences on the mythos of Sonic in entries prior, which would lead to characters like Dr. Eggman to be called Dr. Robotnik in the West, but this time they wanted to keep it consistent, even if they had to make reasons for the revisions to the Japanese mythos. As for the gameplay, the changes were plentiful. A simple one included a change to Sonic's running animation, whereby the distortions on his feet were removed, but more drastic changes came to the levels themselves, most infamously Casinopolis, which changed the original Cowgirl billboard to this generic Casinopolis design. It was deemed a bit too suggestive, especially with how it made moaning noises when interacted with. You know, suggestive elements, not being something Sonic would ever get known for. Which the pinball machine inside was altered to where you can shake it to change Sonic's trajectory, as well as a ball counter added. Though despite Sonic USA's team trying to unify the Japanese and English version with stuff like Dr. Eggman, it seems in the Hedgehog Hammer game, the name Dr. Robotnik stayed in the Western version. On top of that, several camera angles were changed, 3 outside at Station Square, and indoors, 1 more zoomed out at Mystic Ruins, a lower camera at Twinkle Park, a different camera angle at Lost Park and Final Egg, and Chow Garden being slightly offset. And of course, cutscenes in several places were given different camera angles, last amongst them being several object placements being altered, such as the addition of a platform at the end of the roller coaster in Act 2 as Sonic, a change of the shield box to a speed box in Twinkle Park as Amy, which is odd since they don't work on her, an addition of a life box at Skydeck, the falling spikes falling in synchronization as opposed to individually in Lost World, along with the capsule at the end of the level being more centered, along with the springs at Final Egg being on the ground as opposed to being on the wall, the hint box in Hot Shelter being moved, a green barrier added over the doors in Egg Carrier that Gamma can't enter, and 2 Omochao at the Chao Stadium are changed to being closer to the wall. Otherwise, other changes reflected some simple graphics and bug fixes, making for a more stable version, and all packed together to make a complete international version. Now, Sonic is normally more popular in the West. Aside from the usual commercials and ads, a deal was struck with Hollywood Video, where they can rent out copies of Sonic Adventure with the Dreamcast as a means to promote the game. However, what they got was a demo version of the game called the Limited Edition, and so eventually came the release date on September 9, 1999, along with the launch of the Sega Dreamcast in North America. The game was an instant success, selling numerous Dreamcasts and thus becoming the console's killer app, and with strong critical reception to go with it, winning awards, IGN even declaring it as the most graphically impressive platforming game released up to then. Computer and Video Games declaring it as one of the greatest games of all time, and overall high praise given to its presentation. Though some reception was mixed on the cutscenes and voice, with some really enjoying it and thinking it fit well, while others thought they were repetitive or just awful. But one thing that was truly unanimous was the gameplay, feeling it was a true transition from the Genesis era, with GameSpot appreciating the straightforward and linear approach to 3D platforming here, and the notorious top reviewer, Edge Magazine, even declaring it as a worthy rival to Super Mario 64. In the meantime, between the Japanese and the US release, there had also been strong sales for it in Japan too, a region where Sonic never was too popular. Sonic Adventure clearly had been a major success, and even ended up getting the Western cleaned up version released in Japan as Sonic Adventure International. As massive a success it was for Sega, the game was unfortunately the last game the series co-creator Naoto Oshima worked on for the next 2 decades. While nothing is concrete on why the departure, rumors had been floating around that he ran into disputes with Yuji Naka on the direction the series should go in the end leaving the studio and forming his own corporation, Artoon. What was a dream team that the two put together to create the next major leap ended in the divorce of one of the 2 co-creators. Meanwhile, Yuji Naka continued to operate at Sega, but now located at Sonic Team USA, whereby the team continued to work on the Sonic franchise, firmly bringing the series once again back to the US. A first since the failure of Sonic Extreme, and now working on their next game, Sonic Adventure 2. But the story doesn't end here with Sonic Adventure 1, as after release, a truckload of cut content was discovered from early renditions of maps, objects, and models, both on disc and within the many demo discs released. All of which I plan to cover soon, so hit the subscribe button for I'll plan to be back with more Sonic and other games cut content in history soon. Hit the like button and comment below on if you would have liked to have seen Sonic Adventure appear on the Saturn as originally intended. So everyone, thank you for watching!